I can't tell you how excited I am to speak to you. I hope that's not a bad way of starting. I have actually I've read some notes. I've watched the Haitink doc, and unusually for me, I have written some notes and some things that I desperately want to ask you. But I suppose really the first thing is how did you get into all of this? Why do you do the thing that you do?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, it's a sort of rather roundabout way that I've come into it, I suppose. I used to work in current affairs for the BBC, and I then sort of gravitated from that to doing contemporary history. And the first music thing that I did was I was doing a film for the series called People's Century, which went out in the late 90s. And my episode was about the civilian experience of war, of the Second World War. And I was in St. Petersburg to do something about the Leningrad Symphony by Shostakovich. And, but also mainly about the siege of Leningrad that had been for several years in the war, and the terrible privations that people had, and the way that the orchestra had been pulled together when they were really on their uppers to perform various pieces, including a performance of the Leningrad Symphony. And so I thought, well, it'd be a good idea to try and get the orchestra to the St. Petersburg Philharmonic to play a bit of the symphony. So I got in touch with Yuri Temirkanov, who was their principal conductor, and he said, yes, in fact, we're working on that symphony at the moment. That's fine. You can come. You'll have 15 minutes at the start of the rehearsal to record a little bit. I only wanted a short little extract, and well, it wasn't at the beginning of the rehearsal. It was rather in the middle, and I was a bit concerned as we started filming. There were various concerns I had. One was that that I knew that they'd already been playing for an hour and a half, and under British system, that would mean it was time for a break.
Yeah.
And I rather gingerly said to him, "Are you going to take a break now?" He looked at me very sternly and said, "The orchestra will take a break when I tell them to take a break." That was a rational approach. And we, to my relief, we carried on filming. And the trouble was that the floor in that hall squeaked horribly. And I only had a documentary camera, and I think I had a small camera to give me a wide shot. But basically, my cameraman was trying to walk around on the stage during this while we were filming, and every time he moved, there was the most terrible squeak on the floor. I don't know how you can actually have a concert hall with such a loud floor. Anyhow, we did it, and it worked. And that was the first time I'd ever recorded an orchestra. Very, very sort of basic, but it was actually, it led a few years later to my doing a film about Benjamin Britten called Britain's Children, which is my first sort of venture into a full music film. And it was something I'd always wanted to do, was to work in music, because it's a great hobby. And so there's nothing better than to be paid to do your hobby.
What did the experience filming St. Petersburg give you? I mean, you recall the story, but I'm wondering what impact it had on you then, professionally. I mean, did it spur motivation?
Well, it was. I realised what a challenge it was to film an orchestra, which I'd never really thought about before. And of course, I'd only ever seen orchestras being filmed like the Proms, where you've got 8 cameras, and it's sort of it's difficult and complicated, but it's you're never short of a shot. And suddenly I realised that was not going to be the league I would ever be in. That's not my bag, really. I've only ever done that once, I think, when I wasn't directing it. And so documentary filming is very different. And and it was a real challenge, and it remains that. I mean, I learn every time I film an orchestra. I learn more tricks, or sometimes relearn old tricks which I've forgotten, because it's really difficult, and it's a challenge every time. And I remember doing a later film about Benjamin Britten called Britain's Endgame, and we were filming the BBC Concert Orchestra in a hall in northwest London, Watford, the Watford Coliseum. That's right. And my camera, it was very, very difficult because you don't get any rehearsal time. The orchestra turns up about 2 minutes before the start of the session, and you've sort of planned your shots with a whole lot of empty chairs, and then you find, of course, that they're blocking all the shots and things don't work. And so after about half an hour, we were moving cameras around, and my cameraman, I was sort of outside looking at monitors, and my cameraman said to me, he told me later, fortunately, he just passed the back desk of the first violins, who'd said, "This is total chaos, isn't it?" And I realised that, it wasn't only me that thought it was chaos. But I've been reassured by talking to other people who filmed orchestras, and they all say the same. It's a real nightmare. The first 3/4 of an hour of filming an orchestra with documentary crew is exhausting and frightening. Mm-hmm. And then it starts to settle down, and you start to make it work. And as long as you've got a compliant conductor who's not going to get angry with you because it's chaos at the beginning, that's very important, to have a good conductor who's sympathetic.
Is there then, does that, just picking up on the word compliant, does that then suggest that even though officially the conductor is the leader in that space, I wonder whether the dynamic shifts a bit, both for the conductor and for somebody like you, when a documentary film crew comes in? I mean, are you, as a film crew, you coming in pointing cameras at something already going on, or is there a sort of an implied agreement that this is a slightly different dynamic for this particular rehearsal?
Well, there's a huge difference between whether you have asked to film the orchestra, you've called the session, mm-hmm. or whether you're filming something that's already happening. Now, with Bernard Haitink, we filmed him in rehearsal and in performance, and all those things were happening anyway. And so he was in charge. It wasn't a question of my saying to him, "Sorry, could you do that section at the end of the slow movement?"
Would have loved to have seen that, yeah.
I said to him at the beginning, I said, "Look, I just explained to you where the microphones are and where the cameras are going to be." He said, "I don't want to know. just carry on, do it. I don't want to know." And that was very helpful, because I then knew that he was just going to do what he was going to do, and we would fit round it. It's very different if you've called the session. And we did, some years ago, we did a film about Elgar, and we filmed the BBC Symphony Orchestra in a church in North London. And it was conducted by Edward Gardner. And it was tricky because the orchestra didn't really like going to that church. I discovered later this was because of the parking. The parking problems were a bit difficult. And so that was a bit of a no-no. But they were terrific, actually, once they got going. But it was in the winter, and we turned up the heating in the church because it was jolly cold. But the trouble is, as all the equipment was coming in the morning, the temperature of the church went down. And I became very anxious that somebody was going to say it's too cold to play. And so we brought in some heaters. The heaters could only be on when we weren't filming because they made so much noise. And my floor manager was wandering around with a large woolly scarf. I said to her, "You must take that off. You mustn't look as though it's cold. You've got to look really warm." So we got, the orchestra were brilliant in that. But I'm slightly wandering off the point, because the point was the conductor on that occasion was very happy to, when I was still fiddling around trying to sort out camera positions, he was rehearsing the orchestra, and so the time was being used very productively. But there was one time where I really relied on him to take control, which was when we had this wonderful shot of um, of pull focus through the harp strings to the clarinet and the clarinet's music. And when we came to do this, I found that on the clarinet stand was a copy of The Sun, and which he then removed, just before playing. And I thought, now, what do I do in this situation? And I rang. We had a sort of old-fashioned telephone to speak to the conductor, and I said, "Look, Ed, could you tell the first clarinet to remove his copy of The Sun? I don't want to see it again." And so he said, I thought it's better coming from him than coming from me, really. And the whole orchestra, of course, laughed. And I think the clarinet felt a bit stupid. It was a bit peculiar.
Yeah, a bit of an HR issue. Someone's being humiliated.
The broadcasting orchestra used to have cameras around all the time.
Yeah.
I suspect he was just testing me to see what I would do.
Are those choices about whether you call a session or whether you are observing, if you like, are they deliberate editorial choices, or are they sort of pragmatic decision making that then influences how the narrative plays out in a documentary, do you think?
It's pragmatic. I mean, it's better to call the session yourself, because in terms of filming documentary, and particularly about a composer, say, you want lots of short extracts. And if you're observing a rehearsal, you're going to get one movement rehearsed, bits of it over, and it's not going to give you the variety. So it's one of the lessons I learned very fast was don't try and film whole movements. People always say to me, "Oh, we'd love to see the rest of the movement, let's put it as a DVD extra or something." I say, no, we recorded 36 bars and, maybe there's 2 bars either side and that's it. Yes. Because you've got to get some chunks done. And that's where you need a conductor who's going to be sympathetic to the choices, which you discuss with him, obviously, but also to be sympathetic to the idea that you're only going to have 2 or 3 takes at each extract. That's all you can spare the time for. And that means it's not perfect. But we're not trying to do a DVD performance recording. We're not doing a CD recording. We're doing a documentary. And so, I think the audience accept that there's going to be some limitations on that. I know they don't think about it, but subconsciously there's a perception that, this is not an ideal recording situation. And you do the best you can. We with the Haitink film, we filmed him rehearsing with the Netherlands Radio Philharmonic, who were terrific. And it was their first rehearsal of Bruckner's Seventh Symphony. And that was fascinating because he hadn't worked, he does work with them every now and then, but he hadn't worked with them for some time, a year or two. And so it was, it was first principles in a way. And it was really fascinating to see how that worked. And he, as I say, he was very receptive to letting us do what we wanted to do, but he didn't sort of interfere in anything. We didn't interfere with him. We just observed. It worked in that way really well because we got something totally authentic. But the thing with documentary is, I know that I'm not going to have to cover every note with a picture from the orchestra because it's documentary, and you've sometimes got people talking over the music, or you've got the music is illustrated in some other way. You've got archive film, all that sort of thing. And so I always say to my cameraman, normally I would work in recording a performance with maybe 3 cameramen, but on this occasion, we're filming a rehearsal, it was 1, and we had 2 other cameras, fixed cameras, in the hall. And I say, look, don't worry, we're not trying to cover 100% here. If we get 80%, I'll be really thrilled. and actually, we had amazing coverage, even from one cameraman and those two fixed cameras as well. And it's thrilling when that works, but it's high risk.
I want to ask you about something that struck me when I was watching the Haitink documentary yesterday, which reminded me of something I think I saw in the Janet Baker documentary, which was this theme, if you like, that I feel as though I see in your work, which is sort of presenting an artist in I want to say a vulnerable way. I don't mean that you are making them vulnerable. It's just that actually you see them stripped away of that you see them as normal human beings. And I suspect that maybe I am driving at what documentary is about. But certainly I saw it with Janet Baker and absolutely with the bits from Haitink. And there was a sense that actually he was sort of leant slightly forward in his chair. He looked slightly smaller when he was talking to camera, and he always sort of seemed to look down. And I found that rather touching. And I wonder whether that is something which is that. Well, first of all, whether I'm reading too much into it. That's question number one. Number two, is that sort of directed, or is that something that somebody like you stumbles on and goes, "Wow, that's just really touching." Do you understand what I mean? Christ, I hope you understand that. You don't. Oh.
No, it's. I'm sorry to say that I don't really direct that. It's just observing what's actually happening. And with Bernard Haitink, he's a naturally very diffident man who has sort of paradoxically great authority on the podium, but he, off the podium, he's very shy, and he, I think doing an interview like that, it's a bit of an ordeal for him. I mean, it's an ordeal for anybody, but I think it's not his chosen mode of expression. He's not somebody who talks a lot in normal life, and he certainly doesn't talk to orchestras much. It's done an awful lot through gesture, through his facial expression, and his children in the documentary talk about that it was the same with the orchestra as it was with them, that there's a lot that is unsaid but still spoken, and it is very touching. And with Janet Baker it was different. Janet Baker is a much more naturally articulate person. That sounds rude to Bernard Haitink. I don't mean it to be, but I mean she collects her thoughts incredibly quickly and speaks very, very fluently. But she, as you say, I mean, there were moments of intimacy and, well, certainly I felt when doing it that, that I was seeing the real her. And of course, these great artists, we put them on pedestals. I mean, some artists put themselves on pedestals, but I think audiences naturally do. And
that is part of it, though, isn't it? I mean, really, us as audience members putting them on pedestals is, even if it's not intended that way, that is part of the performance. That's almost like the performance contract, isn't it? We kind of expect that.
I think orchestras don't necessarily put them on pedestals. I think they're a bit more discriminating, and it can be the opposite at times. But I mean, of course, when orchestras do really admire their artists, then that's wonderful. If they don't, you soon sort of discover this in the performance, really. But I think the thing is that television is naturally a very intimate medium, and it's partly the way that you do it, and interviewing somebody, it's all close. I mean, under COVID restrictions, it has to be a little bit further apart now, but normally the camera is quite close to the subject, and the interviewer is too. and you could do it at great distance, but and you'd sort of be shouting at each other. And that's in a way how most of us see these artists, because we always see that unless you're sitting in the front row of the festival hall, you see them at a distance, and so there's always that sort of there's a barrier of sorts between you and them, and television breaks that down, and that's one of the exciting things, that you can actually get close to people.
When you were capturing the material for Janet Baker's documentary, did you know? I mean, I know how I felt at the end of it, and for those people who haven't seen it, I'm not going to give the game away, but I did find it heartbreaking. Did you know at the time of capturing it that it was? I mean, did it touch you then in the same way that it touched somebody like me when I watched it?
Oh yes, I mean, obviously, I had no idea that was going to happen. I've been very anxious about suggesting that that Keith, her husband, should take part in the film, and she was anxious too. But in the end, they decided that the film would be incomplete without him. And the scene you're talking about validated that completely. You realise that was the completeness. It explains so much about her career and the way she performed, and the empathy that people felt with her when hearing her or watching her sing. And but it was, yes, it was. You hardly dare breathe at moments like that, and there's always that feeling, that you don't want to. You don't want to milk something that's very emotional, but nor do you want to charge in with a crass question and break the mood. And so it's very difficult, and you have to, you're making sort of instant decisions about, do you say anything? And you don't really know what the camera is doing, because you can't look away. There's a spell there that you can't even. And although I've got a monitor down beside me, if I sort of look down at the monitor when something emotional is happening, then you feel a bit voyeuristic. So you can't construct things like that anyway.
No.
I knew that it was difficult for them to do a joint interview, but it's something they wanted to do. And yes, and you just you it's a spell that you can't break, and you just wait. You have to sort of wait and see what happens.
I mentioned that because I was reminded of it when I saw the end sequence of Haitink talking about his memories of the Second World War, and it struck me that actually there was a big sort of explanatory piece there where he revealed his experience, and that too was actually, it's quite upsetting to see someone of that stature and that age sort of recording something which is clearly still very raw, but it sort of, that you mentioned the word completeness, and I said in relation to the Janet Baker thing, and I suppose that was the sense that I got from that sequence in the Haitink documentary. Yes,
I mean it's not something that I've heard him talk about much before, and I felt it was still raw, as you say, and really, I mean, anybody who lived through those years can never forget them. At the same time, he was anxious. He said to me afterwards, he said, I don't want to suggest that our suffering in the war was anything compared with the suffering of other people, because he said we were lucky. As the film makes clear, his relatives escaped lightly, and although he went through the privations of Amsterdam in the hunger winter and so on, his family was better off, and that they were not struggling in the way that other people were, and he was very anxious that we didn't suggest that it was that he was trying to claim a sort of a premium in suffering. I mean, he said it was difficult, but other people had so much worse problems.
I that message is quite clear, just to reassure you, but it was still very sort of like, one of those moments where you want to reach through the screen and just go, it's all right, it's okay, I don't know what I can do to make this better, but it's all right. And that's a strange thing, considering that he's someone that I have absolutely no knowledge of at all. The other thing that really hit home again, watching it, and here I may overly flatter you, so brace yourself, is that there are sequences in this and the Janet Baker, and possibly in Britain's Endgame, I don't know, I can't remember, where you have people listening to the music and annotating it without using any musical terms whatsoever. And I find that really powerful, because that really plays into something that I believe, which is you only have to hear someone talk passionately about the thing that they love, and that should be sufficient for other people to go, oh, I want to go and experience that. How did you hit upon that format, or was that also pragmatic or accidental? I suspect you're going to say it was accidental.
No, fun enough, I've used that technique, which we call, as a shorthand, we call it complay, sort of commentating while it's playing. I hit on that through a film that I was doing. It wasn't musical at all. It was a film I did about Roald Dahl, and I got. I've always been fussed by arts films that talk about artists or creative people, but fight shy of the art itself. They're very keen to do biography, but not really get to grips with art, with the art. I mean, it's easy to do it with the visual art. You can do that with paintings and sculpture and so on. But with poetry or with literature, and to a large extent with music, it's a challenge, and it's difficult, and yet it's essential, because we're not interested in people's lives as lives. We're interested in how it illustrates the art. And with Roald Dahl, I was fussed about how we were going to get his writing into a film about him. And I thought, well, maybe we get contributors to read little extracts, favourite bits of theirs. Sometimes it was poems, sometimes it was children's stories, sometimes it was it was some of his adult stories. And they embraced this very readily, and they would read it, and we filmed them both reading it out loud and also reading it silently. And we mixed between the two. And I saw that actually there was great power in watching someone's face while they were reading the words, while they were reading them silently to themselves. And you could sense where you were. The only thing is, it's absolutely essential that you don't cheat, that you keep the picture absolutely in sync with the reading. And that's what we learned with in Roald Dahl. And I started doing it, I think the first time I did it was in a film I did about Vaughan Williams. This was 12 years ago. And again, it was essential. It's so easy to say, oh, we'd like to film someone listening to music, and you just sit them in an armchair. And in some cases, you might not even play the music, just film them looking out the window. But if you play the music, then you can cut it around to suit yourself. And it never works, that, because it feels phony. And once I did this with Colin Davis, listening to Elgar's violin concerto. And he was virtually immobile while he sat and listened to it. And then when the violin came in at the beginning of the first movement, his sort of eyebrow twitched. And it was and you knew that there was a moment of emotion for him at that moment. And I did in the same film. I did it with Gerald Northrop Moore, who is the great authority on Elgar, and he was rather unhappy about doing this. So I think he thought it was a bit of a cheap shot. But anyhow, he agreed to listen to the last movement of the Second Symphony. Now, he said he wanted to listen to the whole movement, which was not my preferred idea. It's quite long,
quite busy,
and he told me that there was a bit. I never knew this, but there's a bit in the Second Symphony where the trumpet plays. And this is a tradition in English orchestras. The trumpet plays, I can't remember now the details, but he plays the notes differently from what's in the score. He comes in earlier or something. And it's a tradition that is not in the published score. And he told me about this. And he sat there listening to this piece, completely impassive. And there was not a sort of flicker of an eyebrow, nothing. And I thought, this is absolutely hopeless. And then when it came to this moment when the trumpet came in, he gave me a huge kick in the shins under the table. But again, stayed completely impassive. I didn't use it, but I realised that was the moment for him.
It was hearing somebody talking about, I'm sorry, I can't remember the contributor's name, but hearing someone talking about Beethoven 6 and the part. Sorry?
It was Emanuel Ax, the pianist.
Okay, should have known that. I mean, I did say I didn't do very much research. I know the Pastoral Symphony quite well, I suppose. It had never dawned on me to listen in that much detail to that particular moment in the movement and to be able to discern between the fact that I think he was saying that the string players the violins were doing rubato whilst everything else was sort of maintaining a regularity, if you like. He said it far more articulately than I do. But I adore that detail. And what really struck me was that actually it's not very much, there's not very much technicalness being discussed. And yet it just sort of opens up the joy of this particular art form. And also his Haitink's ability, obviously.
I love that too. He was so eloquent in talking about it, and it was nice because he wasn't talking about a piano concerto. He was talking about a symphony, which, as a pianist, you might think, oh, he just only talk about piano concertos, and clearly, what he does is when he's played a concerto with Haitink, he goes into the audience for the second half of the concert. And, which not all soloists do. And, he loves going to listen. And he did on the occasion we filmed him. He was doing the Beethoven Fourth Piano Concerto. And for the Bruckner Symphony after the interval, he was in the audience. And he's sort of, such is his musical sensibility that, of course, he can see and hear this going on. Very slight rubato where the pulse is constant. But there is a flexibility, and the way the strings can do it is not something you can easily sort of conduct. And he says, I don't know how Haitink does it, but somehow, and he says he doesn't know how he does it either, but it happens.
But the effect of hearing someone talk about that is it makes me want to go off and listen to that. It makes me want to go off and listen to an entire back catalogue of Beethoven 6 performances and recordings in order to listen out for that particular detail and whether someone else has done it or... Do you see what I mean? I think there is something in the way in which people extract that kind of detail which is quite infectious.
Yes. For me as a filmmaker, that's the highest praise, because if there's any point in doing films about music, it's to persuade people to go and listen to the music. Sometimes to, as you say, to familiar pieces and listening to them with new ears, or going and searching out pieces they didn't know. And that is really thrilling. And it happens to me in doing the films. I did a film about the Requiem as a musical form. And I came across, in the research, there are so many hundreds of requiems that have been written over the past 500 years. But I came across one that I didn't know at all, which I think is the most fabulous piece. And it's by Ildebrando Pizzetti. I don't know if you know it, but he wrote this in the 20s or 30s, something like that. It's an absolutely enchanting piece. And fun enough, the other day I was listening during lockdown. I've been listening to a lot of music, which is one of the advantages of having a lot of time at home. And I fished out a really fabulous recording of this piece, the Bizzetti Requiem, by the Westminster Cathedral Choir with James O'Donnell conducting, which is 25 years old, this recording. It's absolutely fabulous, to coin a phrase. I mean, and it completely blew me away all over again. And it was something I only came across because of researching for that film.
What a great
so
job you have.
If it throws me back to the music, I can't I can't complain.
Is there anything else you'd like to say that I haven't asked you, sir?
Well, I'd just like to say that Bernard Haitink, who's been a sort of idol of mine for a long time, I first heard him conduct. The first concert I went to of his, I think, was in 1974 at the Proms, when he did, fun enough, the Beethoven Pastoral and the Britten Spring Symphony, which was really rather intriguing pairing. And I greatly enjoyed it. And I've been to a lot of concerts of his since. And so it was a tremendous, thrill for me to be able to observe this man working with an orchestra, both in rehearsal and performance, and seeing, at the age of 90, just his command was quite extraordinary and his ear was quite extraordinary. You might think, there have been plenty of examples of great conductors who they do live to a long time very, very often, but they start to go off. And, there were the famous stories of Otto Klemperer, who, was sort of manhandled onto the podium because he was so disabled. And he, I knew a player in the Philharmonia who played with him, and he was just, they said, we just follow the leader the whole time.
Yes, I recall a similar anecdote being shared with me at the beginning of my career about another conductor, and it always struck me as a bit like, well, so he's just there for marketing then? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Well, Haitink, absolutely not. He was crystal clear about what he was trying to do, always trying to get the orchestra to play softer. And this is Bruckner, and you think Bruckner's about loud, loud and brassy. But I never appreciated the incredible intricacy and beauty of the scoring of Bruckner. This is in the Seventh Symphony, and and he brings out these lines and the way that he lets the woodwind, their little solos, and he just sort of hands it over to them, and yet there's this pulse going on, and he's inviting them to be soloists at the same time as having the big picture himself. And that was a huge thrill. And Bernard Haitink and his wife Patricia was so accommodating, very hospitable and trusting as we sort of invaded their home in London on several occasions, and very patient. And I just I'm so grateful to them, and I'm in awe of this man, and of course really sad that we won't see him on the podium ever again now.
Thank you very much. I have really enjoyed our conversation. I've long admired your work, sir. And so when Eleanor suggested to me, would you like to speak to John Bridcut? I mean, she will concur. I sent some very excitable emails to her. So it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I've greatly enjoyed it too. Thank you.